My name is Brian Donovan, and I'm the Irish records man in Findmypast. I source all the records and we publish them online. What I want to talk to you today is about what record collections we have in Findmypast about Ireland and how that will help you with your Irish research. The really important news is that we have the largest collection of Irish records anywhere online, and that Irish genealogy is now actually relatively straightforward, unlike what it was in the past. So I want to be able to give you a tour through Irish research. Most people think that Irish research is impossible. You're going to go crazy in trying to do it, and yes, it has challenges. But don't deflect from actually doing research in Ireland, because the rewards are enormous, the records and collections that are available are spectacular, let's find out what we have. A little bit about Findmypast and our work in Irish genealogy. We started only 4.5 years ago. And in 4.5 years, as I said, we've published over 100 million records. And we've done this because we've built really long-lasting partnerships with cultural institutions like the National Archives, the National Library, and many, many other local authority archives. And we've worked really hard to try and find records to fill the gaps where things were destroyed in the past. You probably all know that in 1922, the Public Record Office of Ireland, one of the finest archives in the world, was blown to smithereens in the midst of our Civil War. So what Irish record collections are there? Well, I'm going to give you a slightly different view than you normally have with genealogy. I'm not going to start with birth, marriage, death records and census records, because I want to open your mind up to using other sources. If you've ever done any research in the southern US states, you'll be familiar with what it's like to deal with research in a burnt county, where the records were destroyed. Well, think of Ireland as a partially burnt country. We have a lot of resources, but you need to be creative in how you use them. So I'm going to start with land records. When you actually come to the Findmypast website, there's a plethora of record collections. It's very difficult to get your handle on understanding what is there and to understand how to use them. So we'll start with land records and we'll move on from there. On Findmypast, we have a full collection of the Griffith valuation. Are you familiar with the Griffith valuation? Anybody not know what it is? Okay, there's a few people who don't know. Well, the Griffith valuation is our mid-19th century census substitute. What it is a tax record detailing the heads of every household in the country. And it gives right down to individual plot holders of every little bit of land. These aren't owners of land, these are tenants living in tenements and so on. And we get their names, you get the person they paid rent to, a description of their property and where it is. Very important. We've got 1.4 million householders in the mid-19th century, which gives us a great insight into who is living where. Also, exclusively in Findmypast, we have the maps that went with them, which are all marked up with the individual plot numbers on them, which are incredibly useful to actually get right down to exactly where they lived. Those maps are exclusive to Findmypast. We've also published the landed estate court rentals. Now, in the late 19th century, most of the landlords started going bankrupt. And they couldn't sell their land, so the government stepped in, as they usually do when people who have too much money can't get by, and sorted them out. And they took over their estates and sold them off. In the process, they actually produced rentals, and they name over 500,000 tenants across the country are named. Now, why are these important? Well, they're important because they replace lost resources, lost sources. And to give you an example, here's an example of a rental from 1851, which lists every single tenant and the fact they pay their rent year on year. None of them even have leases. Every year they go to the landlord and pay him money, and he tells him whether he can have his land for another year or not. So this is wonderfully important. I'll tell you why it's so important. I'll give you an example. Are you familiar with the Kearney family of Moneygall in County Offaly in Ireland? Those of you who are familiar with it will probably stick to your back teeth of the story, but this is President Obama's ancestors. And they were shoemakers who lived in Moneygall. And the parish records don't survive for a chunk of the period of time that they were there. So we got over the gap by using this source. And I'm going to zoom in, we can have a look at it. This source tells us that they held the land by a lease in 1800. Now, this is a document from 1851, and it gives you the names of each generation over that time and relationships between brothers and father and son. So we were able to actually stretch out a family tree over the duration, and suddenly we got back to 1800, and we had records available to us again for whatever reason. So it's really important. We also have maps with it, which are wonderfully detailed. We've also got other exclusive records in Findmypast, court and prison records. Now, usually when I mention this, people turn around and say, my ancestors weren't criminals. They weren't caught up in any of these things. Well, Most court cases are not criminal cases, they're civil cases, disputes between neighbours. And the Irish are the second most litigious people in the world. Your guess who the first one is. You know them well. But anyway, it's probably a good reason why the Americans are the most litigious. You're all half Irish anyway. But because of that, the amount of court records that we have is so useful. So let's go and have a look at what we have. The lowest court in the land was the Petty Sessions Court, the Magistrates' Court. They've been around since the medieval period, but they only became formally established in the 1820s. We have 22 million cases which went through those courts, which are available in Findmypast. Now that's significantly more than we have of birth, marriage and death records for the entire country. And most of them are disputes between neighbours. Some of them are petty theft issues, drunken disorderly behaviour, there's quite a lot of those. And people playing sports on public roads. I mean, it's really petty stuff. But it gives you a colour of your ancestors' lives. There's a picture over there on the far right-hand side is a cartoon of an Irish court from Punch magazine in London who loved taking the mickey out of Irish people. But it had some truth to it because it was actually a very, could be quite violent place. But this is really what a Petty Sessions Court looked like. You had the judge sitting on one corner, who was usually the local landlord, and then you had another man sitting at another desk who's a recorder, writing in the books that we digitized. And then you have the community around you. You can see a couple of policemen, and then otherwise it's just locals having their day in court. Wonderfully informative. And this is what they're like if you don't know them, because you probably don't use records like this over here. I'll give you the example on the top of the page. This is a case from Templemore in County Tipperary in the 1890s. And Joanna Maher of Templemore brings to court Patrick Maher of Templemore, and describes that on the night of the 14th of August 1898 at Templemore, the defendant Patrick did threaten the life of Joanna, having previously accused her of witchcraft. Now, we may laugh. A dispute possibly between a brother and sister, we don't know. What did the court do? Well, they determined that Patrick was probably a dangerous lunatic, and they put him into a lunatic asylum. That law stayed the same way in Ireland right up to the 1950s. Any family member could bring another family member to court, and if the court agreed, they'd be put into a lunatic asylum for at least a month. It was overly, heavily used by families to try and police their own members. You can imagine all the different things that happened. Here's another example of a page from my hometown in Ferns in North Wexford. And we have cases of road nuisances, drunken disorderly behaviour, an unlicensed dog. And I'll come back to the dogs in a moment because they're interesting. But you'll notice up in the corner we have the judges. And the very top judge is R. Donovan Esquire, JP. So my ancestors weren't popular in the neighbourhood. They're the local judges. So you're getting everybody, the people who are being brought to court, the people who are actually trying them, police members and so on. Now I mentioned the dog licenses. Now we're not interested in canine genealogy, not yet. We'll deal with humans first. But why are these important? Well, virtually every farmer had a dog, and the courts paid for their services by granting licenses. Sometimes they were licensed to have a distillery. Everybody had their own little local still. Most of them were illegal. But the money they really made out of it was dogs. And there are 6 million names in these dog licenses, and they cover the entire country. What's great about it is they replace records which are now lost. And I'll show you what they look like. Here's an example from Raphoe in County Donegal. Has anybody done any County Donegal research? Well, the problem with Donegal is the climate's appalling. It's really damp. Look at this covered in mold spores, that image. But their records don't survive. The earliest parish registers are not until the late 1870s. This is from the early 1860s. 15 years earlier. So we can actually get a snapshot of the heads of households in that area at an earlier time frame. Very important. And when you're really lucky, look at the other one here. This is from Mount Rath in the middle of County Laois, formerly known as Queen's County. We get the names of the dogs on the right-hand side. There's a little bit of family history you wouldn't have expected to find. Prisons. We had more prisons in Ireland than anywhere else in Britain. The amount of people who went through the prison system in Ireland was enormous. We were a heavily policed country. Don't ever forget the 19th century in Ireland was not a nice time. We had more police in England, twice as many court cases, twice as many people in prison. It was a very, very policed environment. 2.7 million prisoners through the system in the 19th century, out of a population of what, 6? And what do they tell you? Well, if you're lucky enough to have somebody who went through the system as a criminal, you learn loads. You get their name, you get their age, you get their weight, their height, all sorts of details about what they look like. You find out their next of kin, where they were born, where they lived, Wonderful information. You also get the names of the victims in crimes. You'll notice if we zoom in here that you can see a list of all of the crimes committed, assaults on different people, and their names and addresses are there too, and we've indexed all of it. So don't just look at these from the point of view of prisoners. You get the names and addresses of next of kin, victims, and so on. We can totally open up a whole bunch of information about the country. Now, I don't have time to go into too many of these things. The prison service is also responsible for what we consider today to be medical issues. They set up a national inebriate reformatory in the late 19th century because, Ireland has a problem with the demon drink. You probably never heard about that. But they set up a place to put them. It was an old prison, disused prison they used down in Clare in the southwest of Ireland. But every single person who went through this system, we have 2 pages of information about them. We get an entire family history of these people because they wanted to know why they were alcoholics. And then when they left, they went and tracked them year by year through the police service around the country. What happened to them? So they're incredibly detailed. This poor lady here was, she had come from an incredibly poor background, so poor she ended up in a workhouse. When she was in a workhouse, she became an alcoholic. She became quite violent. She kept on being banged up in prison for different things, like deciding to actually go and hit the master of the workhouse or throw rocks at the local magistrate's house. But she ended up she had a fairly miserable life. But this is all described here in detail. And of course, we also have all those people who ended up in the prison service or prison system for being involved in rebellious activities, which of course is a continuous feature of Irish history. Here are the people involved in the rebellion of Robert Emmet in 1803. And of course, they were all sentenced to being hung, drawn, and quartered. Not a particularly nice way to be executed. So they're all there too. So don't automatically think that prison and court's not for me. It's wonderful information. Just hope it is for you. Now, life events. Let's deal with the more traditional records. Birth, marriage, death records. Well, we have a complete index of all of the birth records in Ireland from 1864 onwards when it started. We also have tried to catalogue and show details about where these registration districts are, where these births took place. You'll see there's a map of registration districts. They can be quite complicated to use. So we've tried to make it easier for you to actually work with these records. We've also got a unique service for marriages, a marriage finder, which allows you to try and link together who the likely partners in a marriage might be. You can see in this case here, this lady got married in 1890, and you'll see below that it's one of those 2 men she married. And we know that because there was 2 marriages on the page, and there's 2 women's names and 2 men's names, so it has to be one of these 2 that she married. Hopefully soon we'll actually have the image to go with this, but we're not quite there yet. We also, when we can get them, we get original marriages and baptisms from church records. We have a lot of those coming online over the next while. Big announcement happening tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. But this is an example of a wonderful project we did in County Down, up in the north of Ireland, where we got all the denominations, Catholic, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist, to come together and give us their records, digitize them and index them. So it was a great piece of ecumenicism. And so we have that was the Church of Ireland, that's the Catholic records. We've also got the largest collection of wills online anywhere for Ireland too. Wonderfully useful records wills. Censuses, well, we have them too. Unfortunately, the first full Irish census is not until 1901. The other ones got burnt in 1922. But we have 1901 census and the 1911 census, and we've recovered many of the scraps and bits of 19th century censuses. So we now have 500,000 names from censuses between 1821 and 1851. And we've also been using another source called the census search forms, which I'll show you an example of. This is an example of the 1821 census for Ireland. That's from the Aran Islands out west. They're all Irish speakers out there. This is 1831 from County Derry, Londonderry, up in the northwest. It survives almost completely for 1831. So if you're lucky in the right place, you can have a census record really early. This is 1841, and so on. So there's quite a few of the early census records, even though they mostly were burnt, not all of them went. More importantly, in 1908, we brought in an old age pension in Ireland, but you had to be 70. Now, when did I say that civil registration started? 1864. So how are you going to prove that you were 70? They had to do a search of the census records, and these census search forms survive. And we have 150,000 names from these we've got so far. We've got more to come too. We were recovering information from the 1851 and 1841 census. And this is what they look like. You can actually see the person applying for the census, the search details they're supposed to look for, and then what they found. And all of this has been indexed and is available online at Findmypast. And here's the example from the 1911 census. This is an example of probably a well-known Irish political figure, very appropriate for this year, being the 100th anniversary of 1916. This is James Connolly, one of the leaders, the military leader of the Rising, and his family in 1911. He was executed in 1916. But we have so many more records. I have very little time to go through, so I'm going to rattle through a bunch more records. And when we've done that, maybe you can ask some questions and we can do some back and forth. So I'm just going to rattle through some more now here. We have newspapers, immigration records, directories, and loads more. I'm going to go through them now quickly. Newspapers. We are so excited. We only started doing Irish newspapers a few years ago. We're now up to 111 different newspaper titles across the country. Now, why are newspapers important? You know from your research over here that every village had a newspaper. Every town has one, sometimes two, sometimes three newspapers. It was the same in Ireland. But these newspapers haven't been available before. We have over 300,000 issues, individual newspapers we've now digitized and fully indexed and made available on Findmypast from all over the country. You can see all the places where the newspapers were from. We've got lots more to come too. Here's an example from the early 1860s from Dublin. It's an article about what's going on in Salt Lake City. Ireland was a very international place. It knew what was going on everywhere else in the world, and it wrote about it. So there's a connection between the two, much more so than you might think. We've got our immigration records. From 1890, full ships passenger lists leaving Ireland were kept, no matter where they went. So we have them all surviving. This is all the ships leaving Galway. We have the largest collection of directories, which are extremely important for the early 19th century, the largest collection online anywhere. And we've also got the largest collection of military records. We've got all the British Army service records. Of course, the Irish are a big part of the British Army. We've got so many more. And we're particularly working now on another angle, another side of military. We're working on rebellion records, of which we tend to forget how important security was in Irish history and the great opportunities of Irish history. And I'll talk about that now in a moment. These records are exclusive to Findmypast, just in case I didn't mention it. Electoral registers. Very important again for when the census records are missing. Lots of heads of households, really important. And they tell you all sorts of details about where they lived, not how they voted, unfortunately. You'd love to know that. And of course, in Ireland in 1898, women got the right to vote for the first time. They had to be over 30 and they could only vote in local elections. But that's really, suddenly you get an opening up of the numbers, and it's really interesting. Now, recently, we're now focusing on records specifically about the poor in Ireland. And you're probably thinking, my God, the poor don't leave records. Well, fortunately, in the 19th century, there was an obsession with trying to do something about alleviating the Irish poor. It wasn't brilliant, but the records are very voluminous, and we're digitizing and indexing them. I'm going to start with the Irish poverty loans. Now, I probably don't know about this, but in the 1820s, there was an effort to give microloans to the worthy poor. I always love that term, the worthy poor, to actually try and set up a business or do something. And there are 700,000 names in these records. They're tragic stories because most of these loans were given out before the famine. And if you track them, not a lot of them survived the famine. These are the poorest of the poor. But because of that, they're so much more valuable for our research. We've uncovered information about people who've been lost to history. Unfortunately, the records only cover certain parts of the country. But here's one example. Richard Allen. He's a labourer down in West Cork. He comes along, he takes a loan for £1.10 out. And he has his two mates come along with him, William Melville and Theo Sweeney, as his sureties, guarantors. So they can't read or write, they all sign with an X. And they're all labourers living down in Keelfaddoe, which is right in the west of Cork. And then you can see this is the list of when they paid the money back. You'll notice, you can't quite see it, there's a bit of a spludge over Richard's name down here, but he didn't really pay very much money back. So he got into trouble. And if we follow him forward in time into the 1840s, we find that he appears in the courts. What for? For sheep stealing. Because he obviously didn't have the money to pay back his loan. So what happened to him? He got bunged on a ship and sent to Australia, which is generally what would happen. They came back in the 1850s to find out what everybody in that little townland happened to them, all the people who got a loan. There are 14 people listed here, and you can see Richard Allen in here. And what happened to him? He got sent to Australia. Let's look at the guy below him. The guy below him is a Dennis Bryan, who also got money in 1846. He was a poor labouring man there. Well, he died of starvation in 1847, like so many more of these people. Now, more records of the poor, because in the 1840s, when the famine happened, the government had tried to set something up. They set up the workhouses. Now, we think of the workhouses as being these horrible institutions. Yes, they were, but if there hadn't been workhouses, a lot more people would have died. And these records survive. So we're indexing them. We've done Dublin and Dublin County. We've done Clare. We're doing Sligo. We're moving from county to county. It's a huge project. I'll be at this for 10 years before it's finished, I bet. But the workhouse registers, this is an example of what a workhouse looked like, and the huge scramble to try and get into a workhouse during the famine as people starved, desperately trying to get food. These are the records, what they look like. And you see that all the names are listed here, their ages, their marital status, their religion. You might be interested to know that up to 20% of people who ended up in workhouses are not Catholic. You know, this covers the entire country. The famine afflicted everybody. Also, one thing I always find fun, when you're brought into a workhouse, they separated out the men here and the women there. But here's a list of all the marriages that happened in a workhouse. How'd that happen? Anyway, what's next? I'm just going to give you a quick sneak preview of what we're going to be doing at the moment, what's coming out very soon. So you've just got to register and keep in touch with us because we're producing so much Irish material online. It's so exciting. I was involved in genealogy 20 years ago where there was nothing online at all. There was no indexes. There was nothing available for Irish research. We're about to release all the Irish Quaker records. Wonderful, wonderfully rich records. The Irish Quaker community used to be quite big. And then what did they do? They all came over here. Our records go back to 1660. And they don't just detail births and marriages and burials. They detail what happened in the community. We have births, wonderfully detailed things. Here's an example of all the meetings that were held. They actually detailed every single thing that happened inside the community. All their sufferings, having to pay religious tax. They didn't like doing that. They also detailed the disownments when they were bold and got involved in gambling or drinking or something. They got kicked out. This is all detailed as well. We've indexed all of this stuff that's going to come online. And also when they left, when they moved. This is an example from a Joshua Fuller Doyle from Dublin, who in 1795 gets a letter introducing him to the meeting house in Philadelphia. We have all of these as well. And if you think my ancestors weren't Quakers, why is this interesting to me? Well, I want to show you a Quaker marriage. They're wonderful. Two parties get married, they tell you all about their family. But you know what happens? They list off everybody who attended the wedding because they are the witnesses to the wedding. They're the people who make it actually a genuine wedding. And every name is there. And on the back of the page, they give you their address and their date of birth. And most of the people who were at the wedding weren't Quaker. They're the friends. So keep that in mind. Lastly, but not least, we're now digitizing the records of 1916 and the War of Independence in the 19-teens. I mentioned this earlier, and it's really exciting. Now, our colleagues in the military archives in Dublin have done some wonderful stuff, and it's available on their website for free, so go and have a look at it, military archives. But we're doing an awful lot that they're not doing. We're dealing with all of the police and army records as Ireland was under martial law. Now, that's profound, because when Ireland was under martial law, it meant that the army controlled everything. It meant that any time something went wrong, they would go in, bust over every door, and do a full search and a raid and detail everything about those houses. Most people weren't involved in anything, but I can tell you they didn't like that army guy busting open their door. So we have court-martial cases, because all the court cases were run by the army as well. So we're releasing tens of thousands of court-martial cases, courts in lieu of inquiry when they find dead bodies for whatever reason. We're dealing with all of the case files and the search and raid reports. Here's an example of a court-martial case. This is poor John Corcoran of Castlecomer in County Kilkenny. And if you have to zoom in here, you find out that the military put up a notice at the courthouse in Castlecomer, and there was a bunch of civilians near it, and the army ordered hands up, and all complied except one, who rushed at them, shouting, "I defy the military." Well, he got brought in front of a court-martial, and he's given hard labour for a month for that. The search and raid reports I mentioned. The army would seal off an area, open every single door, and they would list off everybody who was there. There's 35,000 of these search and raid reports. They detail probably a couple of 100,000 people. Why? Well, when they went in, this is a guy called Thomas Farrell, his house they bust into. They went to find him because they thought he was involved in rebellious activity. And they didn't find anything there. But if you go and look through it, there's all these detailed pages about the discussions, what he had to say, what he did, and also the rest of his family are detailed as well. As we move on, this is an example from Inistioge in County Kilkenny. All the names of the family are listed there. Their relationships to each other, their occupations, their address. It's like a little mini census. So we've got all of those coming out. And I should say, now this is the last. This is a teaser. In July of last year, the National Library of Ireland wonderfully released all their images of parish registers. They had all the Catholic parish registers. 3,500 registers, 400,000 images, covers the entire country. Wonderful resource, go and use it if you can, but it's not indexed. And I'm going to show you some examples of what these records look like. I think there's a good chance they might get indexed soon. Keep an ear out tomorrow. We've got so many other records coming out. We've got Merchant Marine, wills. We've got so many other records which are going to become available. It's a really exciting time to be doing Irish genealogy. So please register at our site, keep an eye on what we're doing. We have the largest collection online of any Irish records, and it's growing all the time. So thank you very much.